Hi everyone, how's it going? Welcome back to the channel, and I am here for another discography review. Now, initially I was going to make this a rank video, but it really is difficult to rank this band's discography because, well, of course, as you know, they have several albums, and, it really is hard to really decide and, rank them all from worst to best and things like that. So I decided that I would do a discography review instead, and you guys would still get my opinion on each of their albums. So yeah, the band is of course Iron Maiden. They're a band that I just never get sick of. I can listen to them anytime and just enjoy them every time I turn their music on. Yeah, and it of course all started with the self-titled debut, Iron Maiden, which I think is a great album. And this is definitely my favorite album with Paul on vocals. I know that's a rather unpopular opinion because I know there's a lot of people that actually prefer Killers, but I'm actually one of those people that do prefer the self-titled debut. Mainly because, to me, this album is a lot more classic sounding, like their Black Sabbath influences really do show on this album. And I do just enjoy this album more consistently, and I just think it has more replay value to me. And I don't even have to bother talking about, the songs on this album, because every song on here is pure gold to me. Probably one of my favorite Iron Maiden albums, too. So, yeah. And now we got the second Iron Maiden album, and the last album with Paul on vocals, and that would be Killers. Like I said before, I do prefer the self-titled debut, but Killers is also a pretty good album, but like I said, I just don't think it's as good as the debut. This album is definitely more poppy than their debut, and it's, a lot more upbeat. Yeah, Killers is a good album, but it's nowhere near one of my favorites from the band. And yeah, that pretty much closes out the chapter with Paul, and then of course with with Iron Maiden's third album and the first album with Bruce on vocals, Number of the Beast. Once again, great album. I definitely enjoy this one as well, although I do think this album is rather overrated. I know there's a lot of people that say that this is Iron Maiden's best album, which I don't agree with at all, but it's still a great album, and it is of course a classic album, a really good album, can't go wrong with it. And then of course we got the fourth Iron Maiden album and the second album with Bruce on vocals, Peace of Mind. As you can see, I got the jewel case edition and the reissue digipack. Yeah, what can I say? Peace of Mind. Just great album. Definitely one of my favorites from the band, and what I would consider one of Iron Maiden's best albums. Revelations is just a brilliant song, definitely one of my favorite Iron Maiden songs of all time. Of course, everyone knows The Trooper, and To Tame a Land, the closing track is also really good. But yeah, Peace of Mind, fantastic album. Definitely recommend it if you haven't listened to it. And it's also a really good first Iron Maiden album if you're wanting to check these guys out. But next up, we got Power Slave. Now, this was actually my first Iron Maiden album. This was the album that pretty much helped me get into the band. Maybe my favorite Iron Maiden album. It really is hard to choose a favorite Iron Maiden album these days because there's so many good ones, but yeah, Power Slave is definitely one of their best albums. Yeah, once again, almost every song on here is excellent. Of course, it's got classics like Aces High, 2 Minutes to Midnight, and Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. But yeah, Power Slave is just a great album, and I would even go as far to say that it's one of the greatest albums to ever exist. It's that good. And it's also a really good first Iron Maiden album, so I highly recommend you check it out. Okay, so next up we got Somewhere in Time. Once again, I think this is another good album. And there was actually a time where this was like my second favorite Iron Maiden album behind Power Slave. But yeah, Somewhere in Time is still a great album, but, I think one of this album's biggest problems is that the choruses can be quite repetitive, but, this album does have some of Iron Maiden's catchiest songs to date. This album definitely has a unique atmosphere to it. I definitely enjoy it. So next up, we got Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, which is hands down also one of their best albums. This is the closest that Iron Maiden has gotten to progressive metal. This album is obviously a lot different compared to the stuff that they've released prior, but yeah, this album also has a really unique atmosphere to it. And like I said, I do think that this is also one of their best albums. Once again, I think every song on here has something special about it. But yeah, Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, fantastic album, and I highly recommend it. A great album. But next up we got No Prayer for the Dying. Now, I do think this album is actually underrated. Now, I know there's a lot of people that say that this is one of their weakest albums, but yeah, it's not one of their best, but I don't think it's their weakest either. You know, I might get some flack if I say this, but I actually do like this album more than the majority of Maiden's modern stuff. Yeah, I know, it's an unpopular opinion, but there is some underrated stuff on here. And I know a lot of people say that this is where Iron Maiden started to become less inspired, but I still think it's pretty good for what it is, and I think you really have to go into this album with a more open mind, and yeah. But it is still pretty good for what it is. But yeah, it's not one of their best, but I do think it's rather underrated. But next up we got Fear of the Dark, and this is actually an original pressing. This is the only Iron Maiden CD that I have that's an original pressing, so that's pretty interesting as well. Yeah, what do I gotta say about Fear of the Dark now? Great album. I mean, this album also has a really unique atmosphere to it. It's a very dark sounding album, and this album does have its fair share of underrated songs, such as Chains of Misery and Judas Be My Guide. Those are songs that I would consider underrated. But it also has so many other good songs as well, such as Be Quick or Be Dead, Afraid to Shoot Strangers, and of course the title track. Just a lot of great songs on Fear of the Dark. Definitely a fantastic album, and definitely one of the best in terms of Maiden's 90s stuff. So next up we got The X Factor. Now, once again, similar story. An album that's pretty underrated in my opinion. Definitely one of Maiden's most underrated albums, and this is of course the first album with Blaze Bayley without, you know, Bruce. This is when Blaze Bayley took over the vocals. And I gotta say, out of the two albums with Blaze Bayley, this is definitely the better of the two. This is also a very dark sounding album. Probably Maiden's darkest sounding album, and I love the atmosphere in this album. Definitely a great album. And the next, well, funny story about the next album, I actually don't have it on CD, but I will still talk about it. And obviously the next album is the other album with Blaze Bayley, and the last album with Blaze Bayley, Virtual 11. Now this is very easily Iron Maiden's worst album, and it does have Iron Maiden's weakest song ever, which is The Angel and the Gambler. But yeah, the Virtual 11, just a very uninspired sounding album that lacks replay value. That's really only good for maybe a couple songs. But yeah, nothing really to say about Virtual 11, and you know, you guys probably already know why. You know, it's not in my collection, at least not yet. You know, obviously if I see it for a cheap price, I'll go ahead and grab it just to complete the Discography collection. But yeah, that's my take on Virtual 11. I think that's their weakest album. But next up we got an epic comeback. An epic comeback with Bruce, and he came back in the 2000s era of Iron Maiden, and he returned with Brave New World. Now, definitely one of the best comeback records of all time. And as far as Iron Maiden's modern stuff goes, this is definitely my favorite album by them. I think that this is better than this album is better than anything that came after, in my opinion. But I'll get into the stuff that came after, of course, later on. But yeah, Brave New World, fantastic album, definitely the best in Maiden's modern work. I really like the Wicker Man, you know, great opening track. The title track is also really good. Brave New World's a great album. There's not really much else to say there. Alright, so next up we got Dance of Death, which to me, I think is actually another underrated Iron Maiden album. I know that there's a lot of people that say that this is actually their worst album in terms of, you know, the modern era, which I'm still yet to figure out why. Because this album, to me, I don't want to say it's like Brave New World Part 2, but it's really not much different. Like, I felt like, you know, they used some of the similar stuff that they've used, so, you know, what's the problem with this? Dance of Death has some interesting stuff on it. Definitely a pretty good album. Not as good as Brave New World, but definitely a really good album. So next up, we got A Matter of Life and Death. There was actually a time where I would put this album within, like, my top 5, believe it or not, like, just like a couple years ago. But obviously that has kind of worn out, you know, and it was also at a time when I listened to modern Maiden more. But to be honest with you, this album bores me these days, but it's still not a bad album. It still has some gems on it, but yeah, you know, nowhere near one of their best, but it's still pretty good for what it is. So next up we got The Final Frontier, which by this point you can tell that, like, they're really starting to lose inspiration. And I will be one to admit that I actually do prefer Maiden's 90s stuff over this album. I know that's a little controversial and sort of an unpopular opinion, but I don't know, man. I don't know how you could put this album in front of Fear of the Dark and The X Factor, because the last time I listened to this album, I was honestly kind of bored. I do think that, like, Iron Maiden took the prog metal stuff a little seriously with this album. Now, don't get me wrong, I do like me some progressive metal, but it doesn't really work for this era of Iron Maiden. But Final Frontier, what are my overall thoughts on it? I would just say it's a decent album, but this is actually my second least favorite Iron Maiden album, just behind Virtual 11. I know that's sort of an unpopular opinion, but, you know, what can I say? And of course, lastly, we got the most recent Iron Maiden album, The Book of Souls. Now, another unpopular opinion, I do think this album is rather overhyped. And I may be stepping on thin ice if I say that I even prefer, you know, the band's 90s work over this album as well. Yeah, I really don't think this album is as good as a lot of people make it out to be. Really, this album is only good for like a few songs. I mean, you know, I do like Speed of Light, of course, the lead single. I think that's a great song. And I also really like the title track as well. Definitely one of the best songs that they've done in a while. But those are the only songs on the album that I would consider great. All the rest are either just decent or pretty good. But yeah, The Book of Souls, pretty good album. I do like it more than Matter of Life and Death and Final Frontier, but I don't think it's as good as, you know, their 90s stuff or even the early 2000s stuff. But yeah, Book of Souls is still a pretty good album, but I do think it is rather overhyped. I hope I don't get a lot of hate for that. But don't get me wrong, I still think that this album still has some solid material on it. So, yeah, that is my review of the Iron Maiden discography. Obviously, legendary band. Definitely a band you can't go wrong with, and I would even go as far to say that they're a necessity for any metalhead. So let me know what you guys think of Iron Maiden. What are your favorite albums, your favorite songs? You know, what are your least favorite songs? Just let me know your thoughts on Iron Maiden overall. I think that they're an excellent band, of course. And I think all three vocalists in the career of Iron Maiden all have something unique about them. Sure, you know, they had their weak spots. You know, I think all three of them sort of have their weak spots, but, you know, I think all of them do have a lot of chances to shine in their discography. So let me know what you guys think. Thank you for watching, have a good one, and take care.